Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start with a health warning because I was one of those people on that bus at 8 o'clock this morning, and at 10 to 8 when I debated the merits of either putting structure on my paper or feeling better myself, I went for the swim. So you now have to suffer the fact that I feel better, but my paper is probably not in the sort of nick it should be. But I feel great after that wonderful water. When I was thinking about what I wanted to say today, I thought back and thought that I, during my life, have experienced 3 periods of challenge, very deep economic and societal challenge in the country I was born into. I was born in the mid-1950s into an Ireland that was basically experienced economic stasis and a flight of its people. And I was brought up in South Kerry in that time. And I have these extraordinary memories of we had a shop and so all the world passed through our front door, of people coming at Christmas saying hello when they came back and going after Christmas, and equally in the summer. So that was the South Kerry I grew up in. I do remember the first time that it was announced there was to be a German factory in Carsaveen, and they were looking, and it was announced at Mass, and they were looking for young women to go to Germany to train in a textile factory. And of course the consequence of that German factory, which has since closed, was that women stayed in South Kerry and therefore married, and there were families, and therefore more Kerry footballers, and of course we're always the eye for the team. But as I started my professional life, I experienced the second bout of change and challenge in this country, and that was in the late 1970s and early 80s, when on every single indicator, be it debt or unemployment or the public finances, Ireland either was the worst or second worst in the EU at the time. And then finally, we're back here again. We're back here now not just with one crisis, but we have a banking crisis, a fiscal crisis, a real economy crisis, a social crisis, and a very serious reputational crisis to this country outside our own shores. And the fact that accountability is in the title of both the Glenties Summer School, but also the title today, is suggestive of our sense that accountability is at the root of a lot of what is wrong. And so what I want to focus on today is accountability and performance in the Irish system of public policy. Accountability is one of those terms difficult to define. It's a garbage can concept. It's images of good governance. It involves parliamentary accountability, legal accountability, professional accountability, individual accountability, organisational accountability, all sorts. It's a very big concept, but weakly defined. But there is no doubt that regardless of how difficult it is to define it, I agree with Pat Cox when he says that that part of our DNA is underdeveloped. And it's extraordinary the extent to which tribunals of inquiry, the excesses in the expenses claims, the treatment of expenses regimes in our public system all point to a deep weakness of accountability, to a fact that individuals in the conduct of their posts did not understand that they were accountable to anyone. There were no accountability structures that could hold them to account, or that they didn't have, and this is the trust level, that the trust systems weren't strong enough to know that they were actually spending taxpayers' money. I would argue that the failures of accountability go far beyond unethical behaviour to the performance of our public institutions and those holding public positions of responsibility. And for me, and all of us have our favourite instances over the last 10 years, but I have to tell you, for me, one of the ones that sticks in somewhere here is the Decentralisation project, launched in 2003. There is not a single developed country in the world that would have treated its public institutions the way they were treated in the decentralisation process, because it wasn't decentralisation. Decentralisation is a very good thing. This was a dispersal of public jobs throughout the country in the most extraordinary fashion, and it went completely against the spatial strategy that the government had decided on itself 3 years previously. Decentralisation was costly. It increased the fragmentation of our public institutions. It is a charter for mileage claims, rewards to property owners in our towns, and a very high cost to the Irish public and to the taxpayers. And we still don't know what it costs, how much it costs, or how much it will cost. But what should really worry us is the fact that there was no veto in the system that could stop it. There were no institutional checks and balances that could stop an executive intent on undermining the institutional fabric of the Irish state. And it even didn't work in terms of its political logic, because it was launched in 2003 in order to help win local elections the following year, and it failed. Fianna Fáil had its worst performance in the subsequent 2004 local elections. So even when the political logic doesn't work, one has to ask why this is done. I would argue that accountability must be seen also in terms of responsibility. Accountability is about answerability, about being held to account for actions. But responsibility is also important, and that's in terms of one's obligations, in terms of the posts one's hold. And accountability without responsibility is an empty shell, and vice versa. Now, in 15 minutes, it's not possible to deal with that very broad canvas. So I want to deal with two aspects of accountability. First, the importance of accountability in terms of public catharsis, and secondly, the importance of accountability in terms of improving performance. And we shouldn't, I think, comfort ourselves with the fact that the crisis we're now in is not simply a result of our behaviour over 10 years. The seeds of these challenges were laid in well-established political governance and institutional practices in our state economy and society. And I always am minded by Dick Walsh. He had a lovely phrase early in the 1990s when he said, "But cutting corners, as we've seen, leads to some riding roughshod over the planning laws, company law, financial regulation and other controls designed to ensure that in this republic every citizen is bound by the same code." This was pre our present crisis by a long shot. Nothing changed. So we shouldn't comfort ourselves in thinking that we just got it wrong now. What happened now relates deeply to the way in which we have governed ourselves over a very, very long time. And when one looks at the number of state agencies increased by over 60% since 1990, many of them in the regulatory field, and yet we've had very abject regulatory failure. The Strategic Management Initiative in the civil service didn't equip our system of public administration or our senior public servants with the capacity to identify or guard against the risks to us as a people, given the vicious circle of damaging public and private practices and policies. And until we begin to address those accountability and responsibility issues, we may find the cultural and institutional capacity to come out of this crisis. We may not. I think we're in the red zone. But if we do, we'll simply go back there again. So either we begin to face up to the problems we face that are deep in terms of how we govern ourselves, or we'll be back there at some stage. I hope if we are back there again, I'll have departed this island and it'll be someone else who'll have to think about it, because I think 3 cycles of crisis in one life is quite enough. We don't need to go back there again. But the worry I would have is that if we get out of this, we'll relax again and we'll think, doesn't matter. So firstly, public catharsis. Why is this necessary? Well, it's gone. I had up there the 2 front covers of The Economist magazine. The first one, 1988, that showed Ireland depicted by a mother and a child begging on O'Connell Bridge. And the strapline was the poorest of the rich. In other words, 1988, Ireland was still among advanced economies in the world at the lower end. And then less than 10 years later, there was the other Economist front page, which showed Ireland with this wonderful glow of light around it. Ireland, Europe's shining light. Less than 10 years. And as late as 2006, Le Monde was saying that Ireland was le meilleur élève de l'économie européenne. We believed our own propaganda. We lulled ourselves into thinking that the economy was sorted and it was all right. And one has to ask, why was it in the early years of this decade, when it was clear that we'd had the boom and we had made extraordinary progress, why was it that we couldn't stop and rein in? And the OECD, in its 2003 country report on Ireland, the very first sentence of it, 2003, was, "The era of the tiger is over." Now, how is it that we just simply ignored this and thought the era of the tiger was about to continue? We've had our decade of excess, But as a society, I think it's important for the issues, the deficiencies, the acts of omission and commission by many institutions and many individuals. We need to understand why it happened and who was responsible. And of course, we immediately enter the problem of the many hands, because there are many hands in any decision by government or the system of public policy making. And the problem of many hands means that instead of getting responsibility and accountability, you get blame avoidance and you get blame dispersal. And I'm very struck at the extent to which that's happening already. I read for this paper the Taoiseach's speech to the North Dublin Chamber of Commerce in May of this year. And we had a version of it last night from Micheál Martin, the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Now, the Taoiseach in May said that really, when one looks at it, had the government not done four things, things would be even worse. The four were, firstly, the decision in 2005 to abolish the property-based tax incentives. Secondly, the refusal by the government to abolish stamp duty. Thirdly, the decision by the regulator to start to increase the capital requirements from 100 to 115% for speculative property lending. And finally, the decision by the government to allocate every year 1% of GNP into the National Pension Reserve Fund. I think of those four, only one deserves commendation, and that's the last. The setting up of the National Pension Reserve Fund was a very good thing and a very far-sighted thing. The other three, it was an outrageous claim. By 2005, all the damage had been done with the property incentives. The number of hotels we built that are now empty, the number of shopping centres at the edges of our towns that are really poor buildings, not just poor buildings, but they're empty, and they've drained our towns, the centre of our towns in terms of commercial activity. They were a disaster, and they lasted until 2005, and no one was capable of shouting stop. As for the decision by the regulator to increase the capital requirements on speculative property lending, I don't think we need to say any more. Nowhere in the Taoiseach's speech was there recognition of the recklessness of the macroeconomic and fiscal management during the entire decade. And the Taoiseach was a member of that cabinet, and he was Minister for Finance when some of the most dangerous conduct was happening within our financial institutions. And you can't have responsibility and be in government and blame the opposition because they didn't tell you, or blame international institutions because they didn't point it out to you. If there was regulatory capture by the banks, there was equally political capture of the largest party in the state. It is important that there is an investigation of the banking crisis, and I have to say that one of the things that merits reading is the two reports that we have to date are completely clear and accessible and written in plain English. For those of us who are not economists, who don't understand the ins and outs of financial instruments, I could read them, understand them as a citizen, and I felt good that at least it was on paper as to who was responsible. But it was clear also that the responsibility lies with, firstly, macroeconomic policy, clearly financial regulation. And I think that sentence in the Regling and Watson report that says this was a plain, vanilla property bubble. This was not like complex swaps and all sorts of things that are very difficult to understand. This was very plain and very simple. It was a property bubble in the classical sense. Also, a regulatory philosophy emphasising process over outcomes. And again, I think it's a feature of our government and the way we govern ourselves is that we are far too intent on process and we don't think enough about outcome and outputs. And clearly, obviously, the central bank also failed. I think it's also interesting the extent to which we now have to rely on outsiders to do this for us, that we haven't within our own system sufficient numbers of people whom we can trust to write these kinds of reports. And Patrick Honohan is the interesting exception. There was a very strong sense in the early part of this decade that Patrick Honohan should have been made central banker. Why? At the time, the argument was that he was clearly had worked with the IMF, was continuing to work a lot with the IMF, but he was one of our most significant experts in the country, an international expert in financial markets and in banking. And the argument was that if we put someone like Honohan into the central bank, he would get into the inner circle of the ECB. He would be taken seriously by the ECB. But none of us at the time thought that we needed him in order to guard ourselves. We thought it was because he'd be good for us in the outside world. We needed him at home. And I think we should interrogate ourselves as to why it took the depth of the crisis that we have to put the best person we had in financial services and in banking into the most serious job in that field. Why was it that it was a sinecure for former Secretary-Generals of the Department of Finance since the foundation of the state? And I'm not arguing that they all did a bad job. Some of them were extraordinarily good at what they did, but many of them should not have been in that post. And yet it takes a banking crisis to put Patrick Honohan in the central bank. We need to know why the best person in our society can't get the job in ordinary times as opposed to extraordinary times. And I think that's a crisis in accountability and responsibility. Then moving on to why was it that other parts of the public policy system didn't ring the bells or didn't sound the alarm bells or weren't capable of injecting urgency into the system. And I see Don here, the National Competitiveness Council. Pat spoke about it last night, and I'm going to speak a little about it now. And when I too read, because it is also very salutary now to go back and read all of the reports that were being written in this decade. Those who are discourse analysts are going to write wonderful PhDs on those documents eventually. But when I look at the reports, and the Competitiveness Council has a very fine methodology in terms of the competitiveness pyramid in looking at Ireland each year, I bet it compares with the best anywhere in the world in terms of how competitiveness is analysed and viewed. And it began to warn from the early part of the decade. 2002, it said, wage costs in this report are rising. Irish levels are now above our major competitors. Further divergence, they're above by 3.6% in 2001 and likely to rise 13% on average by 2003. We were joining EMU at the time when we were losing other levers, and this mattered. Wage bargaining mattered. Also, the argument in the report in 2002 said, recent prices and cost developments highlighted confirm a number of worrying trends with consumer price inflation running at more than twice the EU average. And right through the 1970s, the decade, the reports were saying this year in, year out. 2007, just before boom became bust, it showed that Ireland had fallen 14 places in the competitiveness ranking by 2007, and another one, we had fallen by 17 places. So different competitiveness rankings use slightly different methodologies. But the message, regardless of the methodology, was the same. We were going down systematically through the decade. We were losing competitiveness as a small, open trading economy. Our cost base was rising, productivity gains were slowing, and the contribution of trade, in other words, what we earned in the world outside, was small or declining. And the bulk of new jobs in the decade were in the domestically traded sectors, and 65% of new jobs in this decade were either in the public service or in the construction industry, both unsustainable, as we now know. And that clearly comes out in the Radling and Watson report when they identify the fact that our public expenditure accelerated at the highest pace among OECD countries, and the numbers working in the public sector grew significantly, but the public sector pay bill grew even much more significantly. Now, I ask, these reports were published each year. There was always the front introductory letter by the Taoiseach of the day saying competitiveness matters. It didn't have a blind bit of difference. It made no impact whatsoever. And I asked, and I said it to Don this morning as we were heading out to the beach, I said, no one resigned. There was no stink. It was ritualistic. The report was published and frankly ignored, utterly without teeth. And I wonder whether, if the report was being put before the Oireachtas for serious interrogation by an Oireachtas committee, where the government then had to answer for the decline in productivity, that, I think, would have been a much better way of enhancing accountability. But there were also other publicly funded institutions there to advise government, and I sat on one of those myself. The National Economic and Social Council, I spent 5 years going to meetings during this period, and I have to tell you, I'm ashamed of myself. I have no idea what universe I was in as I sat round that table. I read the reports, I made the comments, did my homework. We did one on housing, and no one made the intellectual connection around the table between a housing boom, a credit boom, and what was happening in the banking system. Now, I'm not an economist, but on the other hand, we actually weren't thinking. We were suspending judgment. And I look back on those 5 years and all of the reports I commented on, and I think, what were you doing, lady? I think a lot of us went to sleep at a very high cost to the state and society.
20 gone, Brigid.
Okay, I'll very quickly. Can I say on NESC? NESC also became the epicentre of social partnership. And I think in terms of the epicentre of social partnership, it became far too cosy. And I think social partnership itself became far too cosy. It became agreement at all costs, with the trade unions on the one hand, who were now, trade unions in Ireland are predominantly representative of public sector workers and not society as a whole and not workers as a whole. It's very problematic. And we got, in those of us in public, including myself, in publicly funded institutions, we got salary rises for no response. We didn't tackle restrictive practices, and we didn't tackle performance, despite the fact we introduced PMDS and whatever. Now, I had a lot of other things, but can I just end, because I'm over my time, that I think 7 things that I think we need to think about. Firstly, we better use the Croke Park deal agreement to prosecute performance and accountability, both individual and institutional in the public service. If we don't, and we've got to start by putting on the table what are the things that now happen in our public institutions that are unacceptable. We shouldn't negotiate about the unacceptable. We should simply state where things make no sense and move on. Secondly, we need performance information and measurement systems, not as ones that really contribute to policy making, in other words, that go back into the flow. We need also to marry that with trust-based systems to ensure that those of us who hold publicly funded posts are responsible and accountable for that. I think we also, those of us in publicly funded institutions, need to take seriously the fact that we don't lose our jobs. We have no idea what the psychological impact is of losing a job. And we think we do. We don't. We don't experience it. We have security. We have good pensions. And there should be a premium on that. We shouldn't be paid as much as the private sector. And until we establish what that premium is, I think, again, we're in trouble. We also need to create arenas and occasions where all leaders of our institutions are taken out of their comfort zone and challenged. I'm very struck by how difficult it is for us to listen to discordant and dissident voices in our society. A la Pat Cox last night, we need to take benchmarking seriously, and a la Noel Whelan, transparency. I think everyone sitting on a public body, their CVs should be up, all that information should be out there. The Prime Minister of Sweden, all his post is public. Now, if we knew every meeting an Irish minister had, it would begin to alter behaviour. And finally, can I say that I think we need to develop something called a governance impact assessment. And that is, we've regulatory impact assessments, environmental impact assessments. We create public institutions in this country in an uncoordinated and incoherent fashion. We may have a genius in this country for one type of politics, and we have. You see what we do wherever we go, be it Boston or Chicago or Sydney. The Irish are good at a particular type of politics. In my view, we treat institutions with utter disregard. We don't pay enough attention to institutional health and strength, and we suffer, and our society has suffered very badly because of that. Thank you.